Does the microphone work? No? Don't know what to do about this. So you cannot hear, correct? Can you hear better now? Guys, does this work at all or not? Yes. No one can hear it. I can hear it. Okay, no, because as you know, unfortunately, last week the system didn't record the audio, and I have no idea why. It's not my fault. I just took a picture of it now. It seems to be working. Everything is green, just like last week. I have no idea what to say or what to do. Let me try. So does it, you can hear equally badly like this without the mic? Yes, there's no difference at all. I'll do one thing, I'll try and change frequency, and otherwise, for today, I'll try and use this lectern, but it's painful. Does this work better? No. Equally bad? This is better? The same. This is the only one working well? Okay. So it's going to be painful for me to stay here for 2 hours, but I'll give it a go. And then I'll make sure they give me a microphone that works better than their rubbish. Okay, so everyone can hear me now, right? Good, thank you very much. Okay, so very first thing, again, my apologies for the recording of last week being lost. It's either an ITS problem or a microphone problem. I can't do anything about it. That said, I put 2 old lectures online. You should have seen an announcement. They're on Blackboard. So both of those lectures should make up for what we did last week. They also do the final part, which I didn't do, okay? So don't worry about that. I'll deal with that when we go to week 6 or something like that. Second thing, this week you should have started, actually on Monday for some of you, you should have started with your workshops, with exercises. All good with that? Who's been to a workshop already? How did it go? Glad. Okay, so as I told you last week, by week 2, I will make the game available. I would just like you to first do the exercises, go to the workshop, get a bit of ability about what we've done, study on the book, etc., and then we go live with the game. When we go live with the game, next week I will play it with you, okay? But first I need some time to go through concepts like what we did last week. So now we are ready to start. What we do today is to start talking about perfectly competitive markets, and we will look at the supply side of the market. So that's what we do today. Now, any questions about what we did a week ago? Don't be shy, any question, anything that I covered too quickly, too briefly, anything you want me to explain again? All good? Okay, then let's start. So, the title here is Perfectly Competitive Markets. 3 words, but really 2 concepts, okay? The concept of a market and the concept of competition. So let's start by looking at what is a market in general, whether it's competitive or not. So a market can be defined like this. A market for a given good or service is the set of all the consumers and the suppliers who are willing to trade that good or service. Consumers obviously buy, suppliers sell. So a market shouldn't be thought of simply as a concrete image. So a market is not just the spot where you deal, the spot where you trade, it can be, but more generally for an economist it's a metaphorical concept. So a market is the set of all the buyers and all the sellers. Now, a market is always going to be related to a good or a service. This Coca-Cola can, or an insurance, or the market for education. So what you're buying here, and I'm selling you on behalf of UQ, okay? Now, to make it a bit quicker, most often I will just talk about a good. But don't forget that the same concepts will apply obviously to a service, okay? It's just not to make it too long every time I'm talking about it. Now, this is an important concept that will haunt us for all the course. The concept of a market equilibrium. What is an equilibrium? Well, even the word in English, if you think about it, it suggests a balance, right? Something is in equilibrium when things are not moving. So what do we mean with the equilibrium for a market? We will mean that the supply side and the demand side meet, so that the quantity that the sellers are willing to supply and the quantity that the buyers are willing to demand are the same. Okay? In that case, the market will be stable, will be in equilibrium, will not move. And what's going to be very important, but it will take us another couple of lectures to get there, is the price that helps the market be stable, be in equilibrium. So there will be a magic price for every market in every moment in time that makes so that the demand and the supply meet, that they are the same. Now, these concepts are pretty easy, but let's go to something that is a little bit less intuitive. So we got to talk about it. What makes a market competitive? And actually, we talk about perfectly competitive, where the adverb perfectly means that we are stating something that is ideal, that in reality, most likely it's never going to happen, okay? So I'm going to give you some characteristics for a market to be competitive in the world of ideas. Then in the real life, dirty, it's not going to be so perfect, okay? But we can get very close. And now we can talk about it. So I have a few a few properties here that a market must fulfill in order to be perfectly competitive. So let me take away the word perfectly. Let's think about what makes the market competitive in general, and then, again, we'll talk about the fact that that's just ideal. We need a few of these, a few properties, and these are the following. So first of all, you need the consumers and the producers, so the two sides of the market, to be what we say price takers. Have you ever heard of this? Yes, please, tell me.
It means that they have to take the price of the market sets and multiply it.
Fantastic, that's precisely what it is, and I'll repeat it in case you couldn't hear him. It means that both sides of the market must take the price that is set by the market. They cannot make the price. I'll be very clear about this in a second, and it will help me to clarify this, which is probably a little bit less obvious than others, by talking about the second thing. The good has to be homogeneous. What does it mean? Homogeneous means, yes please, again. Fantastic. So, can you give me a good example of a homogeneous good? Damn, I hate standing in front of this thing. I want my mic back. Anyway, please, go ahead. Good point. Almost always, except that Fiji water manages to charge a damn high price, God knows why. But yes. Another one, anybody? Yes, please. Bread? Bread is already a little bit tougher, right? How often do you buy bread? Once a week? Where do you buy bread? At the bakery? So when you go to the bakery, what do you see? Right? In the good old days, yeah, kind of true, but nowadays, you see that the market is there offering you very different products, right? Apparently different. So there is rye bread, there is white bread, and the prices are very different because they tell you, well, this is an organic kind of bread, etc., etc. So, not so true, right? Other examples. Yes, please. Flour. Again, kind of. Yes, yeah. But similar problem with the bread, right? From different flours. But yes, unless you are an expert, unless you are an expert of flour and you make your own pizza at home and all of that, yeah, we kind of agree. Yes? Yes, but in that case, you could also say, well, soda water is a completely different product, right? So I guess that what your friend was saying over there was, well, give me water, whether it's Coles water or whether it has... In fact, there are plenty of tests done with people who pretend to be experts of different kind of water, that once they do it blindfolded, they just don't recognize the difference, unless, obviously, it's of a particular taste, etc. Yes, please. Tesla's the car, but that's... Okay, what do you mean? Sorry, go ahead. No, I think you're off the mark there. No, but I'll tell you why. Because the good is homogeneous if, independently of the brand or who sells it, etc., the good is exactly the same to the consumer, right? So in order to talk about cars, you have to tell me that all cars are the same. You cannot tell me that a particular brand of car. Do you see what I mean? So, and cars are not homogeneous, because a Ferrari will be very different from a Ford. Yes? Yeah, that's a good point. Yes, electricity is homogeneous, as long as you don't care where it comes from, and most of us don't. Yes? Fuel, exactly, that's okay. I'll stop here just because you helped me, because this is my typical example, fuel. And, sorry, I'm trying to keep it high so that I can stand a little bit farther away. Fuel is the typical example that comes to my mind, and this will help me set up the story here. Fuel, just like water, I suppose, but even better than that, is perfectly homogeneous, right? Even better than water because, as I told you earlier, there may be people who say, well, I only buy Fiji water because whatever, and they're gonna give you a reason, and let's not question that reason. But fuel, come on. Nobody cares what kind of fuel it is, right? Very, 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 very few people are gonna say that they want the V-Power fuel or whatever. So what is the only thing that matters about fuel? The price, exactly, right? Now you start to understand why, if the market is competitive, consumers and producers are price takers. Because the price will be dictated by the market in a way that will take me 2 to 3 lectures to show you properly. And when you play the video game, you will see how it happens. Basically, though, because you are all clever guys, I can already tell you that if the supply is higher than the demand, then the price has to go down until the two meet. If the demand is higher than the supply, the price will go up until the two meet. That's it, okay? Now, if the price is dictated by the market, also because the good is homogeneous, and people do not care if the fuel they're buying comes from John, the petrol station, or Bob's petrol station, right? Then in that case, if I have a petrol station, what can I do? I gotta set the price at the market price. If the market price is $1.30, I cannot try to say, well, I'll sell it for $2, because you're just gonna go to the next door guy who sells it for $1.30. Now, you may think, yeah, well, fair enough, but there are different prices, right? So there are petrol stations with different prices. That is because even fuel is not completely homogeneous, in one sense. The actual good that you put inside your car is homogeneous. We all agree with that. But you are buying a whole service when you get fuel, right? So one petrol station may be on the correct side of the road for you. So you're driving down to Ballina, and you need fuel, and you have one on the left and one on the right, but the one on the right, it would take you 10 minutes to get to, because you have to exit, go back, etc., etc. So where do you go? Well, you have an opportunity cost to add, right? So it may be cheaper, but it ends up not being, right? So it may be cheaper, but it's so far away, or it may be more expensive, but they also wash your car there. And so you're buying a whole service. However, this helps us to understand why consumers and suppliers are price takers. Forget about these two for a moment. We'll talk about them at the end of the course. Full information, free entry and exit. We will deal with all these things one by one, but I need to tell you something already. Full information, why is this important? Again, let's go back to our fuel example. Imagine that you are in a world without full information. For instance, the prices are hidden. Or you don't know that 5 kilometers past this petrol station, there is another one that is cheaper. Then fair enough. The first petrol station can just take advantage of this, right? And charge you more. Imagine all the traffic is going from north to south. The first petrol station will have an advantage on the others and can set the price. But if you have full information and you know from your Google map that there is another petrol station just 2 kilometers down the road, then it's harder to set the price, right? Free entry and exit. Imagine that you are the first petrol station in a town, in the outback. First in the sense that so far you are the only one, okay? Now, in this town, a lot of people are coming in because of a mining boom. A lot of people move there from Brisbane, from Sydney. That guy all of a sudden has a monopoly, can set the price as high as he wants. In order for that market to be perfectly competitive, there must be free entry into that market. So another guy must be able to enter the market very quickly at a very low cost and say, well, he's making a huge profit, I'm going to set a petrol station as well and undercut him a little bit, right? But if there is no free entry, because you need stamp duties, you need a license, you need things like that, then the first guy can actually set the price. And also you need free exit, because if you're making a loss, you want to get out of there without any cost. Now, no externalities and goods are excludable and rival. Really, for the moment, let's leave it there, okay? It's going to be something that we deal with towards the end of the course. Please, no mobile phones. Please. Thank you. Hello. Thank you. I lose concentration. If you write on the thing, I don't lose concentration. Okay, so, but what this means is that goods are basically private goods, that when you buy this can of Coke is for you. So we are not talking about public goods such as education, infrastructure, and things like that, or health, for the moment. If we do deal with public goods, the market is not going to be competitive. Okay, so this was a general introduction to the first part of the course, okay, while we do deal with a market that is perfectly competitive. So let me go briefly about these points again. You need a good that is undistinguishable. Nobody cares if you buy from Jack or from John. It's just always the same product. There is full information in this market. Suppliers can enter the market and exit the market at no cost. And for all these reasons, both the consumers and the suppliers are price takers. Okay? There is one more thing to say about the price taker assumption. If you don't have big enough a market, then you may run into trouble. Then people may be able to set the price. And I've already kind of mentioned this when I talked about the monopoly in the outback town. When I said that if you are the only supplier of petrol in that town, and the others cannot easily enter that market, then you can set the price, okay? So generally speaking, we are going to think that we have a market that is so large that if I increase my supply or I increase my demand, the price will not change. Now, final thing. As I told you from the beginning, this market is perfectly competitive if all of these things are perfectly true, okay? As we have seen, even with petrol, we can find some differences. Even with water, even with bread, we can find some differences. So these assumptions, in reality, are never going to be completely true. So the perfectly competitive market, in reality, is an idealization. But for us, it's a benchmark. So we first study this, and then we see, when we think about reality, we can say, okay, in reality, this actual market is not so close to a perfectly competitive market, it's closer to, say, an oligopoly. And we will study an oligopoly later on in the course. So the first part of the course will deal with these markets, and then one by one I will take away these properties, and we will see what happens when the market is not competitive, okay? Today we start looking at the supply side of the market. So sorry if the general introduction was a bit lengthy, but I think it was useful to set the story. Any questions? Okay. So the supply side. How do I show you how a supplier decides to, how much a supplier decides to produce and sell? I will do it in the following way. Let's assume that our potential supplier here, Steph, has got two productive activities. Remember, like last week, we have a model. A model is a simplification of reality, so I'm going to assume that this person can only do two things. She can catch fish, or she can collect apples. And I care about the supply of apples. Now, what is her productivity? The first bushel of apples will take her 1 hour. The second will take her 1.5 hours. The third 2 hours. 2 hours, sorry, and so on and so forth. Why do I do this? Well, if you remember, why do I set it in increasing way? Because if you remember last week, we were talking about the fact, precisely about the fact that we have the low-hanging fruit story, right? Now, generally speaking, this is always true. What do I mean by this? I mean that, generally speaking, as an empirical fact of life, the cost of production increases. So think about studying. Eventually, you hit the wall. Eventually, you will have you arrive to a point where the next hour is less productive than the previous. It may not be the first one. I don't care if initially it's not the case. But once you've studied for 10 hours in a day, most likely the 11th hour you're not very concentrated. It's less productive. Another example. Any sort of natural resource, which is precisely the low-hanging fruit principle. So imagine you want to look for natural gas. Initially, you get the easiest possible natural gas. Eventually, you have to go down, deep down the surface, or go under glaciers, or go underneath the ice of the North Pole, right? Eventually, it becomes more expensive. Final example. Think of the production in any sort of space, for instance, a kitchen of a coffee shop. You may add you start with one waiter who does everything, makes the coffee, sets the tables, sells the coffee, etc. Now you want to double the production, you may get a second person. You may want to double again the production, you get 4 people in there. Eventually, that place is crammed. If you keep doubling your inputs, the number of people that you have working there, you're not going to double the production. Eventually, you put more inputs, but the increase in production diminishes. And this is precisely what I'm capturing here. Now, I need an opportunity cost of time, okay? Because we saw last week that everything is costly in terms of the opportunities that you give up. So the other activity that I take as an example is fish. And I say, well, you can get 1 fish every half an hour. This one I set it constant. Why do I set it constant if for 10 minutes I've just tried to convince you that the production marginally decreases? Well, I set it constant because it's my comparison. So imagine that if the production of fish marginally increases like the production of apples, you switch to something else, to oranges, to working in the city as a lawyer, to anything else, okay? But you have infinitely many other activities, and therefore you can consider that your opportunity cost of time is precisely that in half an hour, in half an hour you can catch one fish, okay? And if it starts to become more expensive, you switch to another activity that has the same value. So that is my comparison. Now, because we are in a perfectly competitive market, this individual is a price taker. What is the price of an apple? I set it, for instance, at 190, and the price of a fish at 50 cents. Okay? All good so far? Make sense? Now, my question is, how many apples, or bushels of apples, will this person produce? And I'm going to give you an answer that is based on a concept that we will use throughout this course. And the concept is the concept of looking at the margin, always. What do I mean by margin? I mean that you should always think of the next unit and look at what is its cost in terms of opportunity cost and what is its benefit. So you shouldn't start by saying, okay, should I produce 10 bushels of apples? No, you should say, okay, should I produce the first? If yes, then you should ask the question, should I produce the second, and so on and so forth. So the idea is to looking at the marginal cost and the marginal benefit of every action. If the marginal benefit is above the marginal cost, you take the action. If it's not, you don't. And when it stops, you stop there. So let me put it in this table. How long does it take you to collect the first basket of apples? 1 hour. The second, 1 hour and a half. The third, 2 hours. The fourth, 3 hours, and so on and so forth. The time is increasing, right? The total amount of time, it does not matter. You should just look at the marginal amount of time for every unit. What is your cost? It's what you give up. Always remember, the opportunity cost is the value of the next best alternative. Here, your next best alternative is to collect fish, or catch, sorry, fish. It takes you half an hour for every unit. So for as long as the marginal benefit of getting a bushel of apples is above the marginal cost, what you give up, you do it. The moment that it's not worthy anymore, you stop there. Now, what does this mean? This means that the first half an hour, you can get one basket of apples, sell it at $1.90. Remember, this is an assumption I'm just making to show this thing, okay? You sell it at $1.90. You could have got fish. In 1 hour, you would have got 2 fish units. Sorry, 1, apologies. Half every half an hour. So in 1 hour, you would have got the first half, the second half, so 1 per hour. You go and sell it, and you sell it at how much? At 50 cents. Okay? So do you get the first bushel of apples, or do you spend time doing fish? What do you say? I can't hear you. Apples. Cool, because you get $1.90 per hour, the other way you get $1. Now, you do the first one. Do you do the second or not? Yes, because? Because, okay, just walk me through. How much do you make with the second one? Who's speaking? It was totally fine, whatever you were saying, but you help me out if I can see you. You! Gotcha, it's your friend's fault. Okay, tell me.
1.5 times more money.
Yeah, exactly. So in the next hour and a half, okay, I make $1.90, while if I spend that hour and a half fishing, I make $1.50, right? So $1.90 is better than $1.50, so I go ahead. Now, I certainly do the second one. Should I do the third? No, good point. Why? Who's speaking? Yes, tell me.
You make more money out of fish.
Why?
The fish will get you.
No. Make me $2 while I make $1.90 always with the apples. Okay, everybody's happy with this? Makes sense? Obviously the numbers are made so that the calculation is easy, right? Basically with fish I make $1 per hour, always. So the moment that I make more than $1.90 or in the same amount of time, I go fishing. So here I certainly collect the first, I certainly collect the second, but that's where I stop. Okay? This is the idea. Now, what concepts am I using? I don't want to bore you to death. Everything here is written, and I've already described it, okay? But it's written in the slides, it's written in the book. But the idea is to use the marginal benefit of an action and the marginal cost, and apply the cost-benefit principle. So, what does that say? Well, always look at what is the marginal benefit of an action, which is the value of that action at the margin of producing the extra unit. What is the marginal cost, which is the cost, including the opportunity cost, of producing that extra unit. The difference between benefit and cost is called surplus, economic surplus. If there is a surplus positive, you do it. If there isn't, you don't. Simple, right? Are you all happy with this so far? Yes? Okay. I'm sorry if today's lecture is has a lot of concepts that I just have to show, but hopefully from next week, once we settle the bases, we can have a bit more fun. But I have to tell you these kind of things. Now, let's take 10 more minutes to conclude the story about the supply curve, and then in the next half an hour, we're going to talk about the same concepts, but for a firm. And that's going to make more sense from a business point of view. Now, a couple of concepts that I must talk about are these. What is the quantity supplied and what is the supply curve? It's very easy. A quantity supplied is simply how much the seller supplies of a certain good at a given price. So you tell me a price, the price is $1.90, what's the quantity supplied? 2 units in that example. While what is a supply curve? Well, there is a relationship. So for every price, you tell me the quantity supplied. So it's going to be a curve. Now, what is the supply curve for this example that we've just seen? Remember that basically, every hour, you would be making $1 in the fish market. So how can we see it? Well, in the following way. First of all, it's a step function, and it's not a smooth function. Why? Because you jump, because we have only a finite amount of units here. So I cannot supply you 1.2 bushels of apples. Either I supply 1 or I supply 2. And that's why I'm going to have jumps. Now, what does this curve tell me? It tells me that if the price of a bushel is below $1, I supply 0 bushels. This is a graph, sorry. This is a graph where we put the price on the vertical axis and the quantity supplied on the horizontal axis. And this is the way in which we will always look at demands and supplies, okay? What is this first red segment? Well, as I was telling you, it's telling you the following. If the price is below $1, I don't supply anything. I only go fishing. When the price becomes $1, all of a sudden, I'm indifferent between fishing or getting the first unit of apple. But if it's $1.01, I certainly produce apples, up to $1.50. $1.50, I will be indifferent between producing 1 unit of apples or 2. Now, let's go back to the table and we can see why. So the first unit takes me 1 hour of apples, right? So the opportunity cost of that first unit is 1 hour fishing, which is $1. So if the marginal benefit is not above the marginal cost, $1, I don't do it. And that's why, if the price is not above the marginal cost, I don't do it. When it's precisely $1, then I'm indifferent between the two. You have a question? Why do you want? Okay. Can I answer that? So your colleague is asking me why the price is on the vertical axis. I will tell you after the break, if you don't mind, because I want to finish this story, but it's a good point. I tried to trick you into making it appear as if it's normal, but there is an historical reason for that. I can tell you after the break. Other questions? Okay, so let's look at this. Again, at $1, I'm suddenly indifferent. If I spend the first hour getting the apples, or the first hour catching fish, it's the same, right? But if it's $1.01, I'm better off doing apples, correct? Because in 1 hour, I can make $1.01, while if I spend the hour catching fish, I make only $1. So above $1, I certainly get the first bushel. When do I jump to the second one? When the price is above 150. Because if the price is above 150, then the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost. My marginal cost of the second one is exactly 150. What is the marginal cost of the third unit? It's $2. Because it takes me 2 hours. In 2 hours fishing, I make $2. So basically, these points, $1, $1.50, $2, are telling me precisely the marginal cost of that unit. I am happy to take a break now, because I see you are dead. But I want to know the following. Does this make sense? Then we take 10 minutes off. Are you all happy with that? Okay. Then after we start again, I'll tell you why we measure it in this way. Thank you for your attention. You're being fantastic. I know this is a bit dull. Let me put some music on. Right. Does this work? Tell me if it's too high, too low. I really don't know. From here, I cannot understand. Okay. I need your cooperation now. Before I go to the supply of a firm, I want to make sure that what I've done here is clear to everyone. I don't want people to get out of here confused. Usually, I used to do this lecture in a bit longer, okay? So today I'm probably trying to rush through, and for some it's okay, for some it's a bit too fast. So, who's confused about this graph? You are. Please tell me why, and this will help me to try and explain it. What's confusing? Everything. No, but I really appreciate questions. I appreciate if I say things and you guys are silent, I lose touch with you. So I'm not making fun of the fact that everything maybe, it's my fault if it's confusing, okay? So tell me.
I understand that, like, at a certain cost, it's worth more to try to get the fish or to get that.
Yeah.
The thing is that I don't see fish here at all, but they correlate somehow as well.
Okay, good point. Good point. I understand it, and I'll deal with that. No. I just want to collect a few points before I explain it again. Yes, please. Yeah. Okay, I'll deal with that. Second question. I won't deal with that because I don't want to talk about economies of scale today. However, you said, what's the difference between economies of scale and? Okay, then I must deal with that. Okay, other points? Yes, please.
Is marginal cost always increasing per unit?
Almost always, and we'll see that by the end of the lecture. Other questions? Yes, please. I can't hear you, sorry. Okay, that's probably similar to what your friend down here was saying, right? That you don't see fish here, but you see a relation with that, right? Okay, I'll answer that. I'll answer that too, okay. I think I collected enough before I forget. So if you don't understand again, I will ask you a few more questions. Okay, what am I doing here? First of all, when we do a demand or a supply, when we try and graph it, and remember I told you that a supply curve is the relationship between the price and the quantity supplied, okay? So obviously it's gonna be a curve, or a line, in a graph where I must have quantity supplied and price. Now, to answer your point up there, what price? Well, I'm a price taker. I'm a supplier and I'm a price taker. So I'm looking at the supply curve for apples. I'm a price taker, so I must look at the price of apples. And that is the only price that will enter this story. And the only other dimension will be the quantity of apples which I supply at every given price. So that answers your first point, right? Now, you had a question ages ago, someone here, about why price up there and not down there. That's a good point, because you may think that it should be the opposite, because it's the quantity that it depends on the price, right? So if you've done a bit of mathematics, and if you haven't, I don't want to confuse you at all, close your ears for 30 seconds, you would think that I put quantity up here, and that responds to the price. So you give me a price, I give you the quantity that I supply. That indeed makes more sense, but for an historical accident that is due to an economist called Marshall, we do it in this way. And so we just forget about it, and the price will always be on the vertical axis. Now, remember, we are graphing a curve which is a relationship between the price and the quantity supplied. So every point in this two-dimensional graph will be a point that tells me at any price what is the quantity that I supply. For instance, here, and I answer your point to here what's A and B, A is how much quantity I supply if the price is $1.90, like in the initial example that I had. What is B? Suppose that the price of apples for an exogenous shock that has nothing to do with the supplier, because the supplier is price taker, all of a sudden, the price of apples goes up. Because people really decide, the doctor says apples are fantastic for your health. Everybody wants to buy apples, the price goes up to $2.10, and I'm just showing you as an example, in that case, how your quantity supplies changes. In that case, you jump from 2 to 3, from point A to point B, if the price goes up to $2.10. Make sense? I'll go back to it again, but I'm trying to answer all of your points, okay? You had an initial point, which was the following. Okay, this has got to do with fish, but what on earth does it have to do with fish, right? This was what you were saying, more or less. No? Then can you repeat it again, sorry, in case I completely misunderstood.
It does. Like, the question is, like, the graph that is supposedly relying on the fish, right? So there's a step because at one stage you don't need the apple anymore, you should use fish. But I do not see fish whatsoever.
It does make sense, and I'll tell you why. Because everything, so imagine that you don't only have fish, so I make it a little bit more complex. I was telling you earlier that I am supposing that every extra half hour of fishing gives me exactly half a fish. And that's constant there. The marginal cost of fishing is always 1 every half hour. And I was telling you, why do I suppose that that's flat? Well, because you have infinitely many options. So let's say that you can always make $1 every hour somewhere else, okay? If it's not fishing, it's collecting something else, whatever. Now, it would be a bit silly if I had a graph that depended on infinitely many other dimensions. At the end of the day, the only thing that matters when I talk about fish is that it gives me an idea of the opportunity cost of your time. And so the opportunity cost of your time is always $1 per hour. So it does not depend on fish per se. That is just a story that I'm giving you in order to justify why you have an opportunity cost of time, because you could do something else. But it doesn't really no matter whether it's fishing or being a lawyer in a city. I'm just telling you that every hour that you spend doing apples has an opportunity cost for you, which is exactly $1. And so, once I translate it into money, into currency, all that matters is that I have price in dollars here. I don't need fish and I don't need anything else. Have I answered you now? Makes more sense? Thank you. There was someone else that I lost. Someone that said something and I'm missing. We had a question here, a couple of questions up there. Who feels like I didn't answer his or her question? Please, hands up. Okay, and I've done a decent job. Okay, now, up there, you asked me something about the difference between economies of scale and marginal benefit and marginal cost. They have nothing to do whatsoever with each other. I don't want to talk about economies of scale today, so forget about it. The only thing that matters is this. The marginal benefit is the value of taking an action. So why do we say marginal? Because it's the value or the benefit of the next unit that you produce and sell, for instance. What is the marginal cost? It's the cost of producing that extra unit. As simple as that. Am I making sense? Okay, so that's why it's marginal. Now, yes, there was a lady up there that had asked me something in the back, and I'm afraid I forgot you. What did you ask again? Sorry, I answered it? Okay, cool. Okay, now, let me wrap up again about this. Basically, as long as you offer me less than $1, I produce nothing because the marginal cost is above the marginal benefit. When do I start producing one? When you offer me more than $1. But if you offer me between $1 and $1.50, I produce exactly one. At $1.50, all of a sudden, even the second unit makes sense. At exactly $1.50, I produce one, and I'm indifferent between producing the second or not producing it, because the marginal cost of the second unit is exactly $1.50. But if you give me $1.51, then all of a sudden I produce the second unit, up until $2. At $2, I produce 2 units, and I'm indifferent between producing the third or not producing it. At $2.01, I produce the third unit for sure, and so on and so forth. So really, this looks like the following. Sorry for the microphone. At $1, I jump to the first unit. At $1.50, I jump to the second unit. At $2, I jump to the third, and so on and so forth. What do I mean? I mean that really, when we do a step function, the only part that matters are the vertical segments. These horizontal segments, we do them just to make it look nicer. But really, there's nothing in between 2 and 3, because you cannot produce 2.5. okay? So they're all jumps. And this is simply telling you, what is it telling me? I can read it in two ways. I can read it horizontally, or I can read it vertically. So if I read it horizontally, it's telling me, for instance, that at a price of $1.40, I produce exactly 1 unit. Because if I go from $1.40 horizontally up to the point where I hit the segment, I'm producing 1 unit. At $1.60, I produce 2 units, and so on and so forth. This is one way to read this supply curve. Another way is vertically. And vertically, it's telling me, okay, that if I start from 1, I see the marginal cost of production, which is what we also call the reservation price. So if I start from 1 unit down here, 1 unit produced, the lower end of the segment is telling me what is the minimum price that the market must give me in order for me to be willing to produce 1 unit. So these lower ends of the segments are telling me what's the minimum price that I am willing to accept, which is also called the reservation price for the producer. Think about the following. Imagine you're selling your house, or your parents are selling the house. They have a price in mind, right? So you say, well, look, maybe you don't tell the buyer because you don't want to give them any information about this, but you have in mind that below $500,000 you don't want to sell. That's your reservation price. Now, here, my reservation price is very important because it's telling me what's the marginal cost of production. What is the reservation price of the seller? It's the marginal cost. If the marginal cost of producing the 3rd unit is exactly $2, that's my reservation price. $2 is the minimum I will accept to produce the 3rd unit. Does this make sense for everyone? Can you tell me if you're lost about this? Yes, please.
I'm lost.
My fault. I should have asked a different question. You're lost in what sense?
Mostly the horizontally versus
There's no difference. There are just 2 different interpretations. Okay? Let me use a better graph, which is this one. But it's important. I don't want to lose you about this. And if I need more time, I will find more time. I don't want to lose you about this. Okay. Obviously, both things, are exactly okay. Obviously, both things, horizontal and vertical, are exactly the same thing, because this is a curve, okay? I'm just offering you 2 different interpretations. So perhaps I'm overcomplicating it, don't worry, but I'm simply telling you that you can look at a curve like this in 2 ways. You can simply see it like, you give me a price, and I tell you what's the quantity that I supply, okay? So if you give me a price of $3.50, I supply 4 units. Are you with me? Another way to look at it is to start from the quantity and go up. if I start from $4, this is a different interpretation of the curve. What's $3? Sorry, if I start from 4 units, I apologize. What is this point that I meet here, 3? It's the minimum price I'm willing to accept in order to produce the 4th unit. Okay? All with me about this? Okay, then there is one more thing about it, and then I can go on. Imagine that those units become smaller and smaller and smaller, which is the equivalent of saying that I can actually produce 3.1, 3.2, etc. Those segments, vertical segments, will become smaller. Eventually, if you can produce any amount, 3.1, 3.11, 3.111, okay? Imagine that these are liters of Coca-Cola. They are not bushels of apples anymore. So it's a continuous amount. In that case, the supply will be something like this. I don't know if it's a straight line, I don't know anything, but it's not segments anymore. It's just an increasing line. Okay? Now, I can read this in the following way. At a price P1, you are willing to produce quantity Q1. Or I can also read it like, what's the minimum amount that you are willing to accept to produce Q1? P1. Because that must be your marginal cost of production. Okay? So now, think about this. This curve is actually telling you the marginal cost of production. For every unit, Q2 will have a marginal cost P2. Why is this important? Because now you understand why it's an increasing line, an increasing curve. Because it represents the marginal cost of production of the supplier. And because marginal cost in nature is increasing, because the next hour of study will be more expensive for your brain than this hour, because the next bushel of apples will be more costly to get, because the next amount of natural gas will be more costly to find, then that is why the supply curve is increasing. Are you with me over this? You sure? Okay, final questions about this. Anybody who is lost about this? By now, I think you can also tell me I'm lost and I will understand. Okay? Good. Okay, so what is this law of supply? Well, it's just the fact that the supply curve is increasing. And why is the supply curve increasing? Because if the market is competitive, the supply curve is really giving you the marginal cost of production. Now, it's a bit ambitious to try and do what I want to do. If I don't finish it in time, we continue next week. The demand side will be a little bit easier, but I need your attention. So if you are losing me, please hand up and I'll slow down, okay? I want to carry over what we've just done for an individual to something a little bit more realistic, okay? Which is a business, a firm. So because this individual Steph that gets fish and apples is is a bit unrealistic, right? But it was just to set a benchmark and gives us an idea. And it helped us to think at the margin. Now, let's think of a firm. A firm will do exactly the same thing. Will think at the margin in the same way, but there will be one difference. The firm is more complex than Steph. So the firm will have different kind of costs. It's not only the opportunity cost of time. The cost will be divided into fixed cost and variable cost. What is a sunk cost? The sunk cost is a fixed cost that cannot be recovered. Now, let me try and give you an idea of this. So if you think of the costs for a firm, we can think that there are fixed costs, variable costs. Some of the fixed costs are actually called sunk. Leave them out for a second. They're not important for us. I'll define them in a moment better. What are fixed costs and what are variable costs? Fixed, they're fixed because they do not depend on the amount you produce, on the quantity you produce. Variable do depend on the quantity you produce, so they increase with the quantity. Can you give me an example of a fixed and versus a variable? Who's speaking, sorry? Raw material are what? But where do you put them? Variable. Yeah? Whoever answered can give me a fixed? Yes? Rent. Yeah. So classical example, fantastic. So I set up a factory to produce t-shirts. Now, the t-shirts or the cotton is the raw material and it's variable. Because the more t-shirts I want to produce, the higher the cost of the raw material. I need to buy more material. The rent of the place, that's fixed. Say I set up, I rent the place, the factory for the next 2 years, 24 months. If I produce 0 t-shirts or 1 million t-shirts, the rent is the same, independent. What is a sunk cost? Is an amount, is a cost that once you have paid, you cannot recover. The rent is a good example. But not all fixed costs are sunk. For instance, say I buy a brand, and that is a fixed cost, because independently of whether I can sell, of how much I produce, I am the owner of that brand. But the brand can be sold. I can sell it to someone else. Unlike the rent, which once it's paid, it's paid. Okay? So not all fixed costs are sunk, but I don't want to dwell on that because we don't have much time. But you're with me with the difference between fixed and variable, okay? It's pretty easy. Now, an important difference for the supply curve of the firm is the following: the short run and the long run. Now, a famous economist said that in the long run we are all dead, so we don't care about it, but unfortunately I need to speak about it today. What is the short run? Short run is the amount of time over which I do have fixed costs. The long run is the amount of time over which all my costs have become variable. The example of the rent is pretty good. Say that I rent out a place to produce these t-shirts. I got the t-shirt factory. And the minimum rental period is 24 months. 24 months is my short run, because I have a fixed cost. Every month I must pay that rent, and I cannot get out of the lease. After 24 months, I don't have fixed costs. If I want, I recede from the contract. I give up the rent. So that is the time when all my variables, all of my production factors have become variables. Also the rent. If I want to produce 0 t-shirts, I just stop paying the rent. I have no costs at all. Okay? That's going to be important. Now, this is an example to show you how the supply curve of the firm will be slightly different from the supply curve of an individual. So it's a little bit more complex. So here I put, imagine that I have a factory. In this example, I'm producing soda cans instead of t-shirts. And I can hire a number of workers. And I have a fixed cost. I have a variable cost, and I have the quantity that I can produce with those workers. So let's look at it like this. The workers represent my production factor, which is a variable production factor, because I can hire nobody, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And they have a variable cost. They represent a variable cost for me, which is the wage per hour. If I hire 1, I pay $12 per hour, 2, 24, 3, 36, etc. So that's the wage per hour is the variable cost of production. But I also have the rent, which is $100 per hour. Okay, it's pretty high. And that's fixed. Independently of how many people I hire, it's always $100. And then I have my production. Say that with 1 worker, well, if I hire nobody, I produce nothing. If I hire 1 person, I produce 40. If I hire 2 people, I produce 90. 3 people, 120, and so on. Now, this goes to your point initially, Edward, right? Edward? Is that your name? So you asked me earlier, does the marginal cost always increase? And I told you, I'll deal with that in a little while. The marginal cost, in reality, as an empirical regularity, eventually increases. Let's go back to all the examples I gave you. I tricked you a little bit. I told you, well, the 11th hour, it's more costly of study, it's more costly than the 10th. And you didn't disagree with me, at least. Then I told you about natural resources, etc. About the coffee shop. Reality is slightly more complex. Initially, the marginal cost may decrease. Why? Think of the 11th hour of studying. It's true at the 11th hour. But is the second hour necessarily more costly than the first? Often, not always, I don't know if it's always the case, but often, initially, productivity increases, and therefore the marginal cost decreases. Why? Because the first hour is complicated. It's like going to the gym, right? Once you start going to the gym, it's a little bit easier, but starting, it's not so easy. So the second hour may be less costly than the first, but eventually it's going to be more costly. This is exactly the same idea. With 1 worker, I produce 40. With 2, I produce more than double. Again, think of the coffee shop example, and this time I'll make it more realistic. You have only one person in the coffee shop trying to do everything. It's a disaster, right? You are at the register, you take the orders, you serve the tables, you make the coffees, you make the pancakes. If I give you a second person helping you, you probably more than double the production. So initially, the productivity can be increasing at the margin. But eventually, once I crammed that coffee shop and you have 10 people there, the 11th person at the margin is more costly. That's the idea. And so here, you go from 0 to 40, from 40 to 90, but then from 90 to 120, from 120 to 130, and so on. So eventually, you have a marginal cost which is increasing. Does this answer your question? Right. So now we've looked at all this. Let's look at these cost functions. Total cost, that's easy. For every amount you produce, it's the sum of variable plus fixed. So a total cost of producing 40 units is 112, or producing 90, 124, so on and so forth. Now, what is the average total cost? Easy. It's the total cost divided by the quantity. So you take 112, you divide by 40, gives you 280. 160 divided by 135, it gives you 119. What is the average variable cost? I'm sorry if these definitions are boring, but they're necessary. Hopefully, I'll show you why. The average variable cost is just the variable cost divided by the quantity. So 30 cents for the first 40 units, 27 for the next 50 units, and so on. Finally, what is the marginal cost? For every extra worker that you hire, you have to tell me how much has the total cost increased, and you divide by the increasing quantity. So this delta stands for difference. So if you go from 0 to 40, you will have that the total cost has increased by $12, the quantity has increased by 40, it's 30 cents. So by definition, the marginal cost initially is exactly the same as the average variable cost, because it's the increasing total cost is exactly the first $12, and the increasing quantity is exactly the first 40 units. Now, if you want the second line here, 24 cents, then you have to do the next $12 and divide them by 50. And now you see why the marginal cost eventually increases. Why does it increase? Because it's always an increase of $12, but you divide by an increasing quantity which is smaller and smaller. So therefore, the marginal cost eventually increases. Okay? Now, let me see how I can do this in the next 20 minutes without killing you, and then I will take a bit more time next week. So, two things that I want to do. The first thing is the following. You always have to think at the margin. So the idea is always the same one of looking whether the marginal benefit is above the marginal cost. So imagine that I tell you that the price per can is $1.20. So if the price per can is $1.20, and you are a price taker, that is a marginal benefit at which you sell every can. Then you will produce for as long as the next unit has a marginal cost below $1.20, and you will stop if the next unit is above $1.20. So if you go back here, all you have to do is to look at the marginal cost. Will you produce the first 40 units? Yes, because the marginal cost is below $1.20. You'll produce with 2 workers, you'll produce with 3 workers, you will even hire 4 workers, but that's where you stop. You don't hire the 5th, because it would take the marginal cost of production above the marginal benefit. Now, what's your profit if you do that? Here, we use the letter pi, the Greek letter pi, to show the profit. Well, the profit is just the difference between your revenues and your total costs. What is your revenue? The revenue is how much you produce times the price per unit. So with 4 workers, you produce 130 units, and you sell them at $1.20. That is your revenue. What is your cost? It's your total cost. Your total cost when you produce with 4 workers is 148. So the profit is pretty easy to see. $1.20 times 130 cans. This is your revenue, 156. What's your total cost? 148. You're making $8. Okay? Fantastic profit. Now, why am I showing you this? Because I want to show you something about long run and short run. Imagine that the price per can, which I'm supposing it's $1.20, suddenly drops. You're always price taker, so it's got nothing to do with you, but perhaps people stop liking soda cans. The doctor this time tells them that soda cans are really horrible for you. So they don't buy anymore, the price drops, and it drops to 40 cents. How much do you produce? Let's go back to our table. Here. Do you produce with the first worker? Yeah. With the second? Yeah. The third? Yes, but that's where you stop. Because then, a marginal cost of 1.2 is not acceptable anymore. Okay? So now you have to fire somebody. It's a variable cost, you can do it. There's no union involved in this example. You just take the 4th worker, you kick him out, you have only 3 workers. Let's suppose you don't kick him out like that. Let's say that you apologize very profusely, okay? But you have only 3 workers. With 3 workers, you produce 120. And you have a cost of total of 136. Okay, let's look at what's your profit now. Your profit is 40 cents times 120. The price now is 40 cents, remember? So your new revenue is $48. Your total cost is 136. So the profit is negative. You were making a profit of $8. Now you're making a loss of $88. Are you all with me about this? Now, why on earth should I produce if I'm making a loss? If you give me the answer, I promise I stop torturing you for today. Yes, please. I don't know who's speaking, sorry. Yeah, I was looking at someone behind and I was confused. Please. Fantastic, very good point. Here, I have a fixed cost, just to remind you what happens if you shut down. Very good point. So we are in the short run. We can kick out one worker because it's variable cost, but we can't stop paying the rent. So if I shut down, I have to pay the rent, make no revenue, and therefore I'm at a loss of $100. While if I produce and list the loss after I take the rent into account is $88, $12 better. So in the short run, I'm producing at a loss. If the loss were bigger than $100, I would stop producing, pay the rent, end of the story. So this explains you why sometimes you have businesses that are making a loss and they stay open. But when the long run hits, after the 24 months, then I'm out of there, right? Because in the long run, that $100 is not important anymore. Correct? Okay. So I want to show you a couple more things, if I manage. I have 10 minutes. How dead are you? Pretty dead? I think you are too dead. I've tried to do too much. So, trying to think how to leave you on this. Okay, I have an idea. I was being too ambitious to show you everything. We'll finish it when I think I've dealt with you about the whole idea of a supply curve. So, these final slides, they show you how the marginal cost, average total cost, and average variable cost look like. We'll deal with them next week once we've done the demand. We do demand, it's going to be way shorter, and then we finish this part of the supply and we put them together. There is one thing I want to conclude though. We still have some minutes, so I think I can tell you this without giving you more concepts, okay? What I've said here, it's giving you two different shutdown conditions. One for the short run, one for the long run. In the short run, I have a fixed cost, as you were telling me, right? So in the short run, I produce as long as my profit, pi stands for profit, is no worse than the fixed cost. So I can even go, remember a fixed cost is a cost and therefore it's negative. So I can even accept a loss as long as it's no bigger than the fixed cost. In the previous case, any loss up to $100. In the long run, I don't have fixed costs anymore. I don't have to pay the rent. So I only produce if I make a positive profit. This is all that matters, okay? The remaining slides, don't deal with them. We'll look at them once we put the demand together and we finish this part of the supply, okay? Now, before you go, given that we have a few minutes, any questions of what I've done? I know I was killing you today, I apologize. These first two lectures were the longest. Then we will have a bit more time. No questions? Please come back next week because we will finish it properly, okay? Thank you so much for the attention. You've been great. Goodbye.
you.